February 2025. The corridor was quiet, no shouting, no chains clanking, just the slow, steady shuffle of footsteps, one after another, echoing off the walls of the execution facility in Mississippi. Richard Gerald Jordan, 79 years old, had waited nearly half a century for this moment. He had walked through courtrooms, prison cells, and appeals courts for more years than most people spend in their entire careers. Now he was walking the final stretch. To some, he was a condemned man, the longest-serving death row inmate in Mississippi history. To others, he was something far more complicated. A former soldier, a man who admitted his crime, expressed remorse, and spent the rest of his life waiting for a justice system that couldn't make up its mind. Jordan's case wasn't a high-profile media storm. There were no viral headlines, no last-minute campaigns, just a quiet debate that lasted nearly 50 years. The details were straightforward on paper. In 1976, Richard Jordan committed a crime that resulted in the loss of another life. He admitted it, cooperated, pled guilty. And yet the story didn't end there. What followed was a legal odyssey: 5 different trials, 4 death sentences, and decades of conflicting rulings. Laws changed, judges rotated. Jurors grew old. But Jordan remained where he was, in a small cell, waiting for a system to reach a decision it could stand by. For nearly 50 years, his life was confined to routine. Letters, legal filings, solitude. He taught himself to write, he kept a journal, he prayed, and he waited. Over the years, some argued that justice delayed was justice denied, both for the victim's family and for Jordan himself. Others questioned whether the passage of time had transformed punishment into something else entirely. A form of slow erasure, where neither forgiveness nor closure was allowed to exist. His legal team petitioned the courts, not to reverse the sentence, but to reconsider the purpose of carrying it out after so long. Was the man who entered prison in 1976 the same man in 2025? Had the punishment already been served in spirit if not by statute? The state thought otherwise. After exhausting every appeal and legal maneuver, Mississippi set the date. In his final statement, Jordan didn't offer new revelations. He didn't plead for sympathy. He simply said he was sorry not for his fate, but for what had happened 5 decades earlier. He said he had made peace with his conscience even if the world had not. At 7:01 p.m., the sentence was carried out. No cameras, no protests, no media frenzy. Just a man nearly 80 years old, quietly fading from the system that had once made him its most enduring question mark. But this story isn't about the ending. It's about what came before. What led a man, a veteran, a husband, a father, to make one decision that changed everything? Why did the justice system spend decades circling the same conclusion? And more importantly, when punishment becomes endless, does it still serve a purpose or simply become something else? This is the true crime story of Richard Gerald. Long before Richard Jordan's name appeared in court records, he was just a young man from a quiet town in Mississippi. The kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where church bells rang on Sundays, and where small talk filled gas station parking lots. Born in the 1940s, Jordan grew up in a working-class family. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked part-time at a local diner. By all accounts, Richard was soft-spoken, respectful. He played football in high school, dated a girl from the next town over, and never gave anyone a reason to expect anything but an ordinary life. But the 1960s had a way of changing people. When Richard turned 18, he enlisted. The war in Vietnam was escalating. What started as an act of service, a desire to do something bigger than himself, would mark the beginning of a slow unraveling. He served 2 tours, saw things no young man should see, and when he came home, the world didn't feel familiar anymore. Streets were quieter, but his mind was. His girlfriend had married someone else. His parents had aged faster than he remembered. And the war, though over for him, hadn't really ended inside him. People noticed small changes. He was withdrawn, startled easily, he had trouble holding a job. He didn't talk much about the war, only when pressed, and even then just vague phrases like "it was hot" or "we lost good men." In the early 70s, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, hadn't yet entered public vocabulary. Veterans were often told to toughen up, move on, get over it. There were no community counseling centers, no online forums, no hotline numbers, just silence. Jordan drifted. He moved from job to job, town to town. He tried welding, truck driving, sales, nothing stuck. Friends said he never got angry, but he also never smiled like he used to. One neighbor remembered seeing him sit on his porch for hours, staring at nothing in particular. When asked what was wrong, Jordan would shrug and say, "I don't sleep much anymore." By 1976, he was living alone, surviving on odd jobs and whatever savings he had left. He wasn't involved in crime. No prior arrests, no run-ins with police, just a quiet life barely lived. But under the surface, something was breaking down. Financial pressure was mounting, bills were late, he avoided phone calls. He stopped answering letters. Friends drifted away. A man who once had structure, orders, mission briefs, purpose, now had only time and the weight of his own thoughts. It's in that vacuum, authorities later said, that desperation took root. The plan, according to court records, wasn't complicated. He would take someone, demand money, and leave no trace. Not out of hate, not out of rage, but because he couldn't see any other way out. It was one decision on one day that changed every day that followed. When he turned himself in days later, he didn't run, didn't deny, didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He just said, "I did it, I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't mean for it to go that far." To this day, no one close to him has described him as cruel. What they describe instead is a man who never came back from the war, even if his body did. A man lost long before the crime ever happened, and maybe that's what made the case so complex. This wasn't a story of rage or revenge. There was no history of violence. Just a man who made a terrible decision and spent the rest of his life waiting to pay for it. But as time passed and the system kept cycling him through retrials, appeals, and technicalities, one question kept surfacing. When do we stop punishing a moment and start acknowledging the years that followed? Because for Richard Jordan, that moment in 1976 never ended. It just kept playing over and over in silence. It was the summer of 1976 when Richard Jordan, 32 years old, made a decision that would alter the course of his life and ultimately define it. By that point, his days had blended together. He was living alone in Gulfport, Mississippi, working occasional shifts in manual labor, sometimes staying with friends, sometimes sleeping in his truck. Financial stress had quietly turned into something heavier. A feeling of drowning slowly with no one around to notice. According to later court transcripts, the plan wasn't sophisticated. He didn't have a partner. There were no detailed blueprints, no weapons, cash, no great conspiracy. He had one thing, a name, Edna Mee Kaiser, a woman from a well-known family in the area, widowed, financially comfortable, alone during the day. He hadn't met her. She wasn't a target out of personal anger. She was a symbol of a way out. Prosecutors would later argue that Jordan selected her because she seemed vulnerable. But others believed it wasn't about who she was, just what she represented. The plan, as reconstructed in the investigation, involved calling the family, demanding money, and walking away once it was over. He expected it to be quick. He expected it to end clean. But things didn't go that way. Court records indicate that Jordan panicked early in the process. The situation escalated, and in the end, he left the scene alone and empty-handed. For 3 days, he disappeared. No phone calls, no attempt to flee the state, no effort to cover his tracks. And then he walked into a police station and told them everything. He admitted to planning the incident. He admitted to choosing Edna. He admitted that things had gone wrong and that he never meant for it to happen the way it did. His voice, officers noted, was calm, Not cold, just resigned. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He didn't plead the fifth. He simply sat down and described, step by step, how it all unfolded. Investigators later said that it was one of the clearest and most direct confessions they'd ever encountered. There was no attempt to shift blame, no emotional outbursts, no rationalization. When asked why, he reportedly answered, Because I can't live with this." And yet from that moment forward, Jordan would. He would live through 5 trials. He would hear the charges read aloud over and over. He would watch as prosecutors and defense attorneys debated the same details, year after year, courtroom after courtroom. He would see his sentence vacated, reinstated, modified, appealed, and confirmed, each time believing maybe this was the final word. But it never was. The public didn't pay much attention to the early hearings. To them, it was just another criminal case in the post-Vietnam South. Another man who'd snapped. Another tragedy to be filed away. But what made Jordan's story stand out wasn't the moment he confessed. It was the way the system refused to finish the story. Over the next 5 decades, Richard Jordan would remain in legal limbo, neither spared nor resolved. Just waiting in a cell for someone to decide whether the worst thing he ever did defined him completely or if there was still more to say. He never denied what he had done, never claimed innocence. When Richard Jordan walked into that police station and confessed, investigators weren't expecting it. In fact, they were still working through leads, the phone records, the timeline, the missing hours. But suddenly they had a man sitting across the table, calmly filling in the blanks. The interview, according to records, lasted several hours. Jordan never asked for a break, never contradicted himself. He recounted the sequence of events without emotion, but not without clarity. He didn't speak of justification, only responsibility. Detectives would later say they didn't need to press him. He spoke with the tone of someone who wasn't trying to save himself. When asked about details, he didn't hesitate. When asked why he came forward, his answer was simple: "It was wrong. I couldn't live with it." While it's still, a confession isn't the end of a case. It's only the beginning of what the system must decide to do with it. Investigators returned to the scene. They documented what was left. They tracked down the family, informed them of the arrest, and began preparing for trial. The evidence from a legal standpoint was overwhelming. Jordan's statement was detailed. The timeline aligned. Physical evidence supported his account. There was no alternate suspect, no conflicting narrative, no claims of mistaken identity, and yet the case would not resolve quickly. Jordan was initially convicted and sentenced to death in 1976, but it didn't stick. The appeal process began almost immediately, and it would stretch into decades. Over the years, his conviction was overturned, retried, and resentenced multiple times. In one instance, the court ruled that the jury hadn't been properly instructed on sentencing guidelines. In another, questions were raised about whether prosecutors had overstepped in their arguments. Each time, a new trial was ordered. Each time, Jordan was brought back into court. Each time, the facts remained unchanged. And each time, the sentence eventually remained the same. He had never wavered, never denied, never altered his account. But still, the process continued. Legal experts began to take notice. How many times, they asked, could the same case be tried before it ceased to be justice and became something else? For the victim's family, the repeated delays reopened wounds they had tried to close. For the public, the case became a rare example of the death penalty as a process, not a conclusion, a loop with no clear endpoint. Jordan remained quiet through it all. He didn't speak to the press, didn't give interviews, didn't request clemency. He filed appeals, yes, mostly through his attorneys, but his personal voice stayed confined to court transcripts, written filings, and brief statements in legal chambers. There were no dramatic outbursts, no proclamations of reform, just a man in a cell waiting for a system that seemed to keep resetting the clock. Prison officials described him as respectful. He kept to himself. Read often. rarely spoke unless spoken to. He aged quietly while the legal battle around him kept moving in circles. Some saw the appeals as necessary, a sign that the courts were trying to get it right. Others saw them as proof that certainty can become blurred by time. In the end, the investigation had never been the issue. It was solid. The facts were clear. The man who confessed never changed his story. What changed again and again was how the system interpreted what justice should look like. When Richard Jordan first stood in front of a Mississippi judge in 1976, the outcome seemed inevitable. He had confessed. The evidence matched his account. There was no defense strategy built on denial. No complex legal battle over facts. The court sentenced him to death, but that was just the beginning. Over the next 5 decades, Jordan would become one of the most retried defendants in the history of Mississippi's criminal justice system. His case would return to court again and again, not because new facts had emerged, but because the process itself kept breaking down. In 1982, his first conviction was overturned due to concerns about jury instructions. A retrial was ordered, the verdict, death again. In 1986, that second sentence was thrown out, the issue this time a constitutional challenge to how jurors were selected. The case returned to court for a third time. The result: death again. By the late 1990s, Jordan had become a familiar figure in Mississippi courtrooms. His case was no longer just about the original crime. It had become a case study in how legal systems struggle to reconcile punishment with precision. His attorneys argued that constant procedural errors were eroding not only Jordan's rights, but the integrity of the justice process itself. They weren't asking for release. They weren't claiming innocence. They were asking, if the courts can't get it right after 5 decades, what are we really doing here? At one point, a judge offered Jordan a deal: plead guilty again in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Jordan refused. It wasn't defiance. According to his lawyers, it was a question of principle. He had already confessed, already accepted responsibility. But if the state continued to seek death, he said, then they should carry it out, not just threaten it indefinitely. It was a rare stance. A man on death row asking not for mercy but for finality. In 2002, he was once again resentenced to death. This time with new legal counsel, new prosecutors, and a public that had long since stopped following the case. But behind closed doors, legal scholars and criminal justice reformers were taking notice. Some saw it as proof that capital punishment wasn't broken, it was impossible to fix. Others believed Jordan's case was an outlier, a bureaucratic anomaly, not a systemic failure. But either way, the numbers told their own story: 5 full trials, 4 death sentences, nearly 50 years in solitary confinement, and still no final resolution until 2025. During this time, Jordan aged, his hair grayed, his health declined. He spent more time in medical care than legal prep. And yet the sentence stood, prosecutors changed, judges retired, jurors passed away. But Jordan remained in the same 6x9-foot cell, reading, writing, waiting. What began as a legal proceeding had become a kind of existential standoff. The state insisting that justice required death. Jordan insisting that if justice was death, then stop delaying it. The public, largely unaware of the intricacies, had moved on. But legal scholars kept citing his case in classrooms and conferences, not because of the crime, but because of the system's inability to finish the case it started. Eventually, the last appeal was denied. There were no more stays, no more hearings, just a date. Jordan, at 79, would become the oldest person ever executed in Mississippi and among the longest-serving death row inmates in U.S. history. And as that date approached, one quiet question lingered in court documents, editorials. As the years stretched into decades, Richard Jordan became less a name in the legal system and more a fixture within it, like a file that was never closed or a room no one wanted to enter but couldn't seal off entirely. By the early 2000s, he had already outlived many of the people who tried him. Judges had retired, prosecutors had passed away, even some jurors from his earliest trials were gone. But Jordan remained, inside the same cell, inside the same compound, watching the world move on through a narrow, reinforced window. He never caused trouble. Prison officials described him as quiet, bookish, low risk. He spent most days reading legal opinions, religious texts, and long letters he rarely sent. When other inmates made noise, he stayed still. When chaos broke out in other wings, Jordan rarely looked up. In over 40 years, he had only one infraction on his record for having 2 books beyond the permitted limit. He was, in a strange way, forgotten, not abandoned, just unremarkable. He didn't appeal to the press. He didn't write memoirs, he didn't become a symbol for any movement, he simply waited. Medical records later showed he began experiencing health issues in his early 60s. Chronic pain, heart problems, early-stage kidney decline. He never asked to be moved, never filed complaints. Instead, he focused on things he could control, writing in notebooks, filing structured, concise legal motions, occasionally offering legal help to younger inmates who still held onto the idea of freedom. Those who worked at the prison said Jordan always greeted officers by name. He stood for counts. He complied with every search, every transfer, every check-in. There was no resistance left in him, not because he'd given up, but because he had long accepted that his life would end inside those walls. In an interview transcript never published, but reviewed in court archives, one prison chaplain recalled visiting Jordan during a medical episode. He said Jordan looked up from his cot and asked softly, "Do you think it still matters who I was?" The chaplain reportedly didn't know how to answer. Because by then, Jordan wasn't the man who had walked into that police station in 1976. He wasn't a combat veteran freshly returned from war. He wasn't a confused 32-year-old who made a desperate, terrible decision. He wasn't even an inmate fighting for his life anymore. He was, as one correctional officer put it, just an old man waiting for a date on paper to turn real. That date came in early 2025. His final appeal had been denied the year prior. There were no more motions, no new judges, no technicalities left to uncover. He was offered a final meal. He declined. He was asked if he wanted to contact family. There was no one left to call. In his last 48 hours, he received 2 visitors, an attorney and a prison minister. He spoke little, listened more. He didn't express fear, didn't protest, didn't ask why. According to the minister, Jordan spent most of his final conversation not talking about death but about time. "It moves strange in here," he said. "Some days feel like years, some years feel like a blink. But the strange part is how long it takes for anything to end." At 79, Richard Gerald Jordan walked. When the news broke that Richard Gerald Jordan had been executed, it barely made a ripple. No breaking reports, no national headlines, no outcry from activists, no celebration from crowds. Just a short paragraph in the state's press release, confirming that the sentence issued decades earlier had finally been carried out. But for those who had followed the case, who had studied it, written about it, or simply remembered it, the silence raised louder questions than any outburst ever could. Because this wasn't a typical death row case. This wasn't about guilt versus innocence. The facts were never in dispute. Jordan had confessed, had never asked to be declared innocent. He admitted what he did from day one. And yet what lingered after his execution wasn't the memory of the crime. It was the memory of the time in between, 49 years, 5 trials, 4 death sentences. A legal carousel that spun so long no one could remember where it had started. What does it mean, people began to ask, when a punishment takes longer than a lifetime to enforce? What does it mean when a man is punished more by time than by judgment? Was justice served? Some said yes, the system followed its course. Others said no, that justice delayed for nearly 5 decades becomes something else entirely. For legal scholars, Jordan's case is already being taught in classrooms, not because of the crime itself, but because of what came after it. His file has become an example of what happens when due process turns into inertia, when legal certainty becomes legal hesitation. Was it fair to carry out a sentence so long after it was handed down? Is a punishment still meaningful when the person receiving it has already been transformed by time? In 1976, Richard Jordan was 32. He was impulsive, desperate, unmoored by war and drifting through life. In 2025, he was 79, quiet, stooped, long past the man he had been when the system first deemed him unfit to live. And that raises a question not just about Jordan, but about all of us. When we talk about justice, are we talking about punishment or are we talking about process? Is the goal accountability or closure? And if someone lives long enough to change, to shrink, to forget what freedom feels like, have they paid, or are they still waiting for someone else to decide that they've paid enough? Richard Jordan's name will not be remembered the way others are. He didn't spark national debate. He didn't write letters to the world. He didn't beg for forgiveness or fight to the end. He waited, quietly, until the system finally did what it had promised but never rushed to do. And maybe that's the most haunting part, that the system wasn't cruel, it wasn't kind. It was simply slow, relentlessly slow. In the end, Richard Jordan's story wasn't about guilt or